In today's video, the Galbra family operated under the firm belief that legal consequences were merely a polite suggestion and that their local reputation made them untouchable. It was a philosophy that held together reasonably well, right up until the moment they decided to pay an uninvited midnight visit, armed with knives, to the Griff Caravan site. This is a case breakdown, not a documentary marathon. We cover the incident, the police response, and the trial. No unnecessary padding, no dramatic pauses for effect. In the quiet residential patchwork of Nuneaton, there are plenty of reasonable ways to spend a Thursday evening. You might nurse a warm pint at your local. Spend 20 minutes debating whether that pint was actually worth the price, or simply abandon the pub entirely. Grab a 4-pack from the off-license and park yourself on the sofa for the night. Options that, crucially, carry zero risk of a multi-decade prison sentence. The Galbra family, however, operated on an entirely different frequency, one that was louder, more aggressive, and considerably less sensible. On the 9th of May 2025, brothers Michael, Thomas, and Anthony Galbra, accompanied by James Galbra, who appeared to be present largely out of family obligation, collectively decided that a quiet night in simply wasn't going to satisfy them. Rather than settling for board games or an argument over the television remote, the group chose an evening of forced entry and coordinated violence. It was, by any definition, a poor choice of leisure activity. Their destination was the Griff Caravan site, a location that, prior to that night, was notable primarily for being a place where people lived in caravans, rather than a venue for organized brutality. The group arrived shortly after midnight, which is traditionally the hour favored by people whose plans cannot withstand daylight scrutiny. Their targets were a young man and a woman, both in their 20s, who were, quite understandably, attempting to sleep. The Galbras bypassed any notion of knocking. They forced their way inside with all the subtlety of a structural collapse. Picture the scene from the female victim's perspective. You are woken from sleep to find multiple men forcing their way into your home, screaming threats and carrying bladed weapons. She was presented with a binary choice: engage with the situation or remove herself from it immediately. She chose the window. The exit was improvised rather than elegant, but it was effective, and she escaped. The male victim was not as fortunate in his escape. He attempted to run, but the Galbraiths appeared to interpret a man fleeing for his life as an open invitation to pursue him. They chased him across the caravan site, eventually catching up with him and inflicting multiple stab wounds that were, by every indication, intended to be fatal. It is a particular kind of family coordination, one that most households reserve for moving furniture or organizing a barbecue, repurposed here for something considerably more sinister. The group left the victim bleeding on the ground, climbed back into their vehicle, and drove away, presumably under the impression that the evening had gone according to plan. What they had actually done was set a very loud, very traceable countdown clock running on their own liberty. They were, in the language of people who study these things professionally, already caught. They just hadn't been informed yet. In the immediate aftermath, the Galbraiths made no serious attempt at concealment. When your criminal enterprise involves multiple family members, a specific location, witnesses, and a victim who survived, blending into the background becomes structurally difficult. While the male victim was in surgery, and surgeons were doing work they had not anticipated needing to do that evening, the Galbraiths were busy being exactly who they always were. James Galbra concluded that remaining in Warwickshire was not in his best interests, and relocated to Limerick, Ireland. It was a decisive geographical move, the sort that implies a belief that the Irish Sea operates as a permanent legal boundary rather than a body of water that extradition paperwork crosses without difficulty. It does not function as a legal boundary. It never has. Back in Nuneaton, the atmosphere carried the specific tension that settles over an area when a serious crime has been committed by people who are known locally and have not travelled far. The Galbraiths likely assumed their reputation would act as a buffer, that people would look away, stay quiet, and allow the whole matter to dissolve. What they had not adequately considered was that Warwickshire Police were already reviewing footage, collecting evidence, and building a case file that was growing more substantial by the hour. The family had not merely broken the law. They had done so loudly, in a traceable location with identifiable individuals, leaving behind physical evidence, digital footprints, traumatized witnesses, and most inconveniently for their plans, a victim who was alive and able to speak. The ideal outcome for anyone wishing to evade accountability had not materialized. The victim's survival was the single detail that unraveled everything that followed. As the morning of the 10th of May arrived, the Galbraiths were, in all probability, sleeping with the ease of people who believed themselves beyond consequence. They were not yet aware that Warwickshire Police had effectively already concluded who was responsible, and were now in the process of constructing the mechanism that would bring them into custody. The investigation was not beginning. It was already well underway. The detectives had their suspects. The suspects had left them an extraordinary quantity of evidence, and the process of converting that evidence into courtroom-ready documentation was moving forward with quiet, methodical efficiency. If the first chapter of this case reads like a low-budget crime thriller filmed on a caravan site, the second chapter is something altogether more procedural. A detailed, painstaking police operation in which the Galbra family discovered too late that evading a modern investigation requires a level of planning they had never demonstrated any interest in developing. Warwickshire Police did not ease gently into this investigation. They approached it with the sustained focus of an institution that had been handed an unusually well-documented case and intended to use every piece of it. The inquiry was led, in part, by Detective Constable Chloe Butcher, and her team operated with the understanding that the evidence trail was broad, digital, and essentially impossible to erase completely. The central challenge of investigating a crime committed by a family group is not identifying the suspects. That tends to become clear relatively quickly. The challenge is assembling every piece of corroborating evidence in a form that will withstand the scrutiny of a Crown court. Butcher's team set about doing exactly that, pulling CCTV footage, mapping phone data, tracking vehicle movements, and documenting everything. The first major enforcement action came on the 22nd of May 2025. Just before 5:30 in the morning, Woodside Park near Brighton-on-Dunsmore became the location of a coordinated police operation involving approximately 100 officers. The scale of that response was not arbitrary. You do not deploy that level of resource against a family that poses no organized threat. The Galbraiths had a reputation, and the operation was structured accordingly. The search produced results that suggested the family had been operating as though accountability was something that happened to other people. Officers recovered thousands of pounds in cash, multiple stolen vehicles, and a range of items consistent with a household that had long regarded the boundary between legal and illegal as purely decorative. Anthony, Michael, and Thomas were arrested. The expressions of people who had walked into that morning believing themselves to be powerful rarely survived the moment the handcuffs close. James remained in Limerick. This situation was resolved through established legal channels. The Garda assisted, the extradition process moved forward, and James was returned to Warwickshire to stand alongside his brothers. His time in Ireland had been brief and had provided no lasting protection. With the four brothers in custody, the investigation entered a phase that elevated the case from serious violence to something considerably more complex. James Galbraith Sr., the family patriarch, and a man named Thomas Madonna concluded that the evidence against the brothers was too substantial to leave unaddressed and decided to attempt to dismantle it from the outside. The strategy they chose was the mistaken identity defense, a creative position suggesting that the victim, during the course of being stabbed multiple times at close range in the dark, had somehow misidentified his attackers entirely. Statements began to emerge. Some came from individuals who had not been present at the Griff site. Some appeared to have been produced under considerable pressure. The narrative being constructed was that the Galbraith brothers had been confused with other people by a traumatized victim, and that the actual perpetrators remained unidentified. This approach underestimated two things simultaneously: the clarity of the victim's account and the systematic capability of the police to trace where statements originate, how they were obtained, and whether the people providing them were doing so freely. Butcher's team followed the paper trail that the cover-up had created, identified the pressure that had been applied, and built a secondary case running alongside the primary one. By attempting to obstruct the investigation, Senior and Madonna had not reduced the legal exposure facing the family. They had increased it. The case that was eventually presented to Warwick Crown Court was comprehensive. 7 weeks of trial. The jury was walked through every element. The movements of the brothers on the night of the attack, the forced entry, the pursuit, the stabbings, the flight, and then the subsequent attempt to falsify the evidential record. Detective work, in this instance, had produced results that were not easily challenged. The female victim's testimony addressed what she had experienced directly, being woken by armed men. The decision to exit through the window, the escape. Her account carried weight precisely because it was specific, clear, and consistent. The forensic evidence, blood recovered from the scene, medical documentation of the male victim's injuries, and the mobile phone data placing the brothers at the location, covered the technical dimensions of the prosecution's case. The cell tower records, in particular, served as a detailed chronological map of the brothers' movements on the night in question. The defense presented by the brothers relied principally on the position that the attack had either not occurred as described, or that the involvement of the defendants had been overstated. It was a difficult argument to sustain against the volume of evidence presented, and the jury did not find it convincing. The mistaken identity subplot, as presented through Senior and Madonna's involvement, was addressed as part of the same proceedings. The prosecution demonstrated how the false statements had been generated, who had been involved in producing them, and the methods used to pressure witnesses. It was, as the court was shown, a coordinated attempt to interfere with a criminal prosecution, and it had been documented thoroughly enough to become a prosecutable matter in its own right. On the 13th of March 2026, Warwick Crown Court returned its verdicts. Michael, Thomas, and Anthony Galbraith were found guilty of attempted murder. James Galbraith was acquitted of the principal charges, an outcome that reflected the jury's assessment of the specific evidence presented against him, and which stood as a reminder that proximity to a crime and provable participation in it are legally distinct questions. Sentencing was delivered by His Honour Judge Andrew Lockhart KC. The judge described the attack as deliberate and coordinated, a planned effort to take a life. The sentences that followed reflected that assessment without qualification. Michael Galbraith, 27, received 25 years imprisonment plus 3 years on extended license for attempted murder and threats to kill. Thomas Galbraith, 24, received 25 years imprisonment plus 3 years on extended license for attempted murder and threats to kill. Anthony Galbraith, 21, received 24 years imprisonment for attempted murder and threats to kill. James Sr. and Thomas Madonna each received sentences exceeding 3 years for their roles in the conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The cumulative prison time distributed across the family exceeded 80 years. It was, by any calculation, a significant structural rearrangement of the Galbraith family's immediate future. As the brothers were taken from the dock, the practical reality of the situation became impossible to dismiss. The Caravan site visits, the local intimidation, the assumption of untouchability, all of it was behind them. What was ahead was a substantial period of time in which the consequence of one night's decisions would be paid for, incrementally over years. The male victim carries permanent physical and psychological damage from that night. The female victim carries the memory of leaping from a window to survive. Those are not outcomes that resolve when a sentencing hearing concludes. They continue. The Galbraiths went to the Griff Caravan site on the 9th of May 2025, intending to demonstrate power over other people. What the subsequent months produced was a detailed, public, legally documented demonstration of how completely and efficiently that power can be removed. They were not, as it turned out, difficult to catch, difficult to charge, or difficult to convict. They were, as the evidence showed clearly and consistently, exactly who the investigation said they were. The lesson is not especially complicated. It is simply that confidence and impunity are not the same thing, and that mistaking one for the other, at sufficient volume and with sufficient witnesses, tends to produce a very long prison sentence.